What's actually harder to deal with, a difficult partner or a difficult colleague that you can't block or unfollow?
It depends, and that they're hard for different reasons. So in the workplace, maybe you have a little bit more control over what team you're on or who you interact with. Certainly you can't just block your coworker, right? Because you might have to be with them on a team. But occasionally you do have some agency about, here's the team I want to work with, or this particular individual is not pulling their weight, and you might be able to have actually a clearer avenue for giving feedback. Hopefully that's part of the company culture.
It's interesting because clinically I've been working with people for many years, and I hear stories of people whose life is so difficult because of the people in their workplace and also the more intimate relationships. So I think it just depends so much on the unique situation, and people can be really affected by people who maybe don't matter so much but that you're spending so much time with, like in a work setting. And then people are so impacted by family members who mean so much to them, even if they're maybe not seeing them regularly. So I think it's just important to name that any situation can be difficult, any relationship can be difficult. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm really passionate about psychology and mental health, and I'm the author of Beyond Difficult.
I'm a professor of psychology at Pomona College. I direct a laboratory that focuses on the science of healthy relationships, and I am the co-author of Beyond Difficult with Rachel.
And I'm Di Gillett, and this is the Power of Women podcast. We're a platform that celebrates and showcases the strength, resilience and achievements of women from all walks of life. And if you have a brand or a business that you believe aligns with the community that we're talking to at Power of Women, we would love to talk to you about partnerships and advertising. And you can reach out to us on the website www.powerofwomen.com.au. And I mentioned that at the Power of Women, we celebrate resilience. And when it comes to our own resilience, sometimes that's about learning how to deal with the people who test us most. Whether it's at work, around the dinner table, or perhaps even when you look in the mirror, navigating so-called difficult relationships is something that we all face. And today we're going to go beyond the eye rolls and the awkward silences with two powerhouse psychologists, Dr. Jessie Stern and Rachel Sampson, whose new book, Beyond Difficult, reveals the science behind challenging behaviour and how to communicate through it without losing your cool or perhaps yourself. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jessie Stern and Rachel Sampson. Welcome to the Power of Women podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
And congrats on getting the book out, just recently released. Who did all the writing?
It was a team effort.
Both of us.
Yeah, shared.
It really was.
And was anybody difficult?
I can honestly say no. This was the smoothest process.
Fantastic.
Really hit the jackpot.
Brilliant. So we all know a difficult person, but what I'd like to touch on is what about if it's us? So how do you know if you're somebody else's difficult?
I think any time that there's tension in a relationship or a situation with someone else, we can be curious about whether we are part of that difficulty or tension. But I think the clearest indicator that someone perceives us as difficult is if we get direct feedback from the other person about that. So if someone comes to us with a complaint or with feedback that they are finding something about us difficult, then we can be confident that they are experiencing us as difficult, whether or not we agree with that perception or not.
And to Rachel's point, we can also ask for feedback, right? So if the person is behaving in such a way that makes us think, gosh, did I say something that really ticked them off? It's okay to inquire and as Rachel said, to be curious. Hey, I noticed after our conversation, you didn't text, and I was just wondering, was there anything that I did that I brought to the conversation that, was not good for you? It's always okay to ask.
So if we feel for whatever reason that our communication or being a tad difficult is actually warranted, is the onus on us to change, or is it on the individual to come around to cope with our particular style? Where does that responsibility lie?
I think it really depends on if you value the relationship, if you value the situation, and it's important to you to show up in a particular way in interactions. We know that lots of difficult people are not invested in changing, that's not something that they want to do. And so I think as an individual, whether or not the onus is on you depends on whether you want to change, and not everybody does.
I agree, and would just add that sometimes stepping up and changing what we can change is a way to take back power in a situation where we feel perhaps powerless. So, for example, we tell a story in the book about a woman who was dealing with a difficult boss. And she had given feedback a number of times, and this boss was just not changing her behavior, and it became really tense at work. And so one of the things this person did was, even though ultimately the onus was on her boss to be a kinder person, she stood up and gave the feedback and tried to change her end of things by setting some boundaries and by naming, hey, here are some things that I think would make our meetings better. And her boss actually agreed to some of them. It was a negotiation process. But part of what I love about her story is that she actually, even though the onus is ultimately on her boss, she's able to take back power in the situation by giving clear feedback and by outlining, here are some specific things that we could do better so that our working relationship is better. And I think that's kind of nice for her own feeling of empowerment, that she's not just helpless.
Yeah, I like that. You're sort of taking back agency and getting on the front foot. So I think that's a great idea. So when we actually call somebody difficult, is it really about them, or are there times when that's really about our own discomfort?
So I think that we say in the book there is no universal definition of a difficult person, and it really is subjective. But there are some behaviours that would be generally considered to be difficult. So people being cruel or aggressive or controlling or abusive, just to name a few, would across the board be considered difficult behaviour. But there's a whole lot of behaviour that I might find difficult that Jessie might think, that doesn't really bother me too much. So it really does depend on our perception of what's difficult and our own unique personalities. So it is really subjective.
And that was going to be one of my questions. So it is a subjective, it is simply how we find it, yeah?
Yeah, and I think oftentimes the difference, the subjective part, comes from our implicit expectations of a relationship. And I'll say, just as an example, my own mother and I have different expectations about how quickly somebody should respond to a text message. So I'm a millennial, she's a baby boomer, and my social expectations are a lot more loose. So to me, being in a responsive friendship with someone means if you get back to me within a week or so, I know we're still having a conversation. With my mom, who comes from a different background, a different set of expectations, she's very hurt and feels rejected oftentimes if somebody doesn't get back to her right away. And part of that is her own stuff, but part of it is just a difference in expectation. So she finds one behavior difficult that I don't, and part of it might be that we communicate our expectations. So when I work with students, for instance, I let them know, hey, here's what I expect in terms of how quickly I'd like a response from you, and here's what you can expect from me. But oftentimes we don't make those things explicit. We just assume that everyone shares the same set of expectations. And so if the person doesn't know what you expect of them, and now we view them as difficult, part of the onus on us is to actually say, hey, when you don't get back to me, here's how I feel. Could we agree that, this is a reasonable amount of time?
And you've raised a really interesting point, because I can imagine generational differences is one of the things that is mistaken or misunderstood as difficult. And it's just, generational traits. We grew up in a different time.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to the reasons why attachment theory seems to be having quite a cultural moment right now, and looking at that. So for those of us who've been raised to just get on with it, which I have to admit is me, I mean, that would be a catch cry that I can remember from way young. How does understanding our attachment style help when that's the case?
Well, one of the fun just bits of backstory about the book is that Rachel and I actually met at an attachment training in Minnesota, and that's how we started writing together, because we were so inspired by and personally impacted by the science of attachment. So I actually think it's wonderful that more people are getting access to this knowledge. But basically, the idea of attachment is that our early experiences shape the way we view ourselves, our expectations of other people, and how we behave in close relationships. So if I've had the great fortune to have a sensitive, responsive caregiver when I'm young, I learn implicitly that I'm somebody who's worthy of love and care, and I will act accordingly. And I also learn that in general, other people are trustworthy, they have my back, and in general, I can expect that they'll be responsive to me in relationships. And if you go into the world with that set of assumptions, if you enter a romantic relationship, let's say, and that's your operating assumption, things tend to go more smoothly for you because you are more responsive and you tend to elicit responsiveness from other people. But on the other hand, if I haven't had that good fortune, and there are many of us who have not, if I have a caregiver who was rejecting or belittling or said, oh, don't be such a crybaby, I don't want to hear it, then I might develop an avoidant attachment. And that comes with a view that other people are not so interested in our emotions. They're probably going to be rejecting, so I got to take care of myself. I have to put on a protective layer and be the strong person and not lean on anybody. And you can imagine how, for a while, that might really be adaptive. That might be the best thing you can do to get through your childhood. But then when it comes to intimacy, to be really close with somebody, it can be hard to be vulnerable because you're so accustomed to hiding that part of yourself. And then finally, for folks who have had really inconsistent caregivers, sometimes you're there for me and sometimes you're not, and I don't know what to expect. Those folks develop what's called anxious attachment, and they tend to be a little bit more needy and clingy. So some of the difficult behavior we might expect from an anxiously attached person is to be a little bit more dependent and to amp up their emotions. So everything feels like drama, and they have a little bit of a harder time regulating their feelings. So for folks who have been raised, with maybe a just get on with it mentality, I think moving a little bit more towards security would be to say, I can acknowledge when I'm not doing okay, and I don't have to just get on with it. I can actually feel what I'm feeling and maybe even turn to somebody and ask for support. I would say that would be maybe a first step.
I feel like I just had a therapy session, Jessie. That's so attachment theory or our attachment style is really all about nurture. It's nothing more or less than that.
It is really strongly linked to nurture and the experiences that we've had, especially early in development. But Rachel can probably also add in that our temperament or our biology also matters. But the strongest predictor of our attachment style is the pattern of social experiences we've had. But those can change. So even if I was an insecurely attached kid, even if my parents were not there for me when I needed them, there is always the opportunity to seek out more secure relationship partners. So the beauty of growing up and being an adult is now I've got choice. Like, you don't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. You can choose your romantic partner. So you can choose the people who make you feel safe, supported, and seen. And so when we change the environment, we can also change our attachment style well into adulthood.
So some of us have a more sensitive temperament. And so while temperament doesn't determine what kind of attachment style that we have, there are some people who from birth are more sensitive to their environment and to relationships than other people. In pop psychology or pop culture, these people tend to get the label highly sensitive person, but really these people are more susceptible to their relationships. And so from birth, these more sensitive people are more impacted by the quality of relationships and the type of experiences that they have, and tend to have a harder time when that nurture is lacking. But the bright side of this temperament type is that these same individuals are also more likely to benefit from nurture. So when these people have nurturing, supportive, really loving relationships and experiences, they actually soak up that nurture and tend to flourish above and beyond someone in the same situation who has a less sensitive temperament. So these people are sensitive for better and for worse.
Yeah. And I know we've all had or many of us have made those throwaway lines about people being difficult. But would it be fair to say we're often dealing with the caregiving that they've had? I mean, we talk about difficult partners in relationships, and we blame our mother-in-law or whatever. I mean, is it a fair call to point the finger elsewhere when we're struggling with somebody in our immediate sphere?
It is often the case that it is someone's past showing up in the present. And our relationship style is like the dance that we do with other people, and we learn that dance in childhood, and then we continue to carry that dance into adulthood with current partners and friends. And so very often it is what we've learnt in our early years that then we're reenacting with other adults. But also, again, temperament plays a role. So there are some people who may be less open, less agreeable, less emotional, less sensitive by nature. And if you're someone who is looking for that, then it may be that person's temperament also feels tricky or difficult for you because it's just different to what you're seeking. Even if the dance overall is okay, it may be that they can't fully fulfill some of your emotional needs because they're not wired that way. And we haven't talked about neurobiology and neurotypes, but some people are neurotypical and some people are neurodivergent. So we know that there are people who are autistic, gifted, have ADHD. And again, that comes with a whole different array of strengths and challenges and different capacities. And so if we are dancing with someone who has a different neurotype, that also might feel difficult because we're doing a different dance.
Yeah, understood. Well, coming up, we're going to shift gears and we're going to get into the office politics that nobody trains for. If you're loving the Power of Women podcast, be sure to jump onto our YouTube channel and hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss an episode. So we're going to have a look at what happens when that difficult person isn't your ex and it is in fact your boss or your team member sitting 2 seats down in the office. What's actually harder to deal with, a difficult partner or a difficult colleague that you can't block or unfollow?
I'm curious what Rachel has to say, but I think it depends and that they're hard for different reasons. So in the workplace, maybe you have a little bit more control over what team you're on or who you interact with. Certainly you can't just block your coworker, right? Because you might have to be with them on a team. But occasionally you do have some agency about, here's the team I want to work with, or this particular individual is not pulling their weight, and you might be able to have actually a clearer avenue for giving feedback. Hopefully that's part of the company culture. But also there are really interesting power dynamics in a workplace that are kind of layered on top of some of those difficult interactions. So if I'm in management and I have a difficult employee, I have a little bit more agency to give feedback and do something that might actually help them in the long run, if I frame that feedback as, I'm here to coach, not criticize. That's what Adam Grant likes to say about giving feedback. The trickier part, I think, is when there's a power differential where you are in the place of limited power in your workplace and you're trying to give feedback to a boss, and that can be extremely challenging. So one of the things we know about company culture is that folks are more likely to stick around when there is a culture of feedback. So if there are regular opportunities for me as an employee to tell folks higher up than me, here's what's working for me and here's what's not, they're much more likely to stay, because adjustments can be made along the way that make the workplace better for everybody. So I'll give a brief example. When I was in graduate school, I had an advisor, so somebody who was essentially my boss, and she would invite me to regular meetings at the end of each academic term. And the meetings were a two-way street, and feedback should always be a two-way street, especially in a workplace. So she would ask, what's your self-evaluation? What has gone well for you, do you think? And what are you struggling with? And then similarly, what is going well for you within our relationship? What am I doing as your supervisor that you'd like to continue? And what's something that's not working well for you? What's something that needs to change? And out of those meetings, there were so many little adjustments that both of us made that probably were the reason I was able to stick it out through 5 years of grad school. And we have a good relationship to this day, but it didn't necessarily start out as smooth sailing. So I would say in the workplace, maybe you have those built-in structures for giving and receiving feedback. But I'll let Rachel talk about the more intimate settings.
It's interesting because clinically I've been working with people for many years, and I hear stories of people whose life is so difficult because of the people in their workplace and also the more intimate relationships. So I think it just depends so much on the unique situation, and people can be really affected by people who maybe don't matter so much, but that you're spending so much time with, like in a work setting. And then people are so impacted by family members who mean so much to them, even if they're maybe not seeing them regularly. So I think it's just important to name that any situation can be difficult, any relationship can be difficult. And I think the strategies that we might employ to deal with it may be different, but as Jessie was saying, it really does depend on what's within our control and what power we have within the relationship. But one of the things that I think is different about a work setting and a closer relationship is that we're probably not trying to get our emotional needs met from someone in the workplace. It's likely to be other things that we're finding difficult. Whereas in close relationships, one of the things, a theme really that comes up in sessions with people who are seeking therapy for difficult relationships is that they're feeling like their emotional needs aren't being met in a close or intimate relationship. So that may be that they're feeling misunderstood by someone in their life, that there's different expectations, as Jessie was saying. It may be that there's different conflict styles or really different temperaments where one person has high emotional needs and really values talking about emotions and sharing and being vulnerable, and the other person is maybe more avoidant. So sometimes those attachment styles are coming into play, and one person might be wanting closeness and more connection and more intimacy, and the other person is more avoidant and standoffish and finds intimacy threatening or stressful. So sometimes then the approach would be about seeing if the bridge can be gapped between those differences.
And I can imagine that if that whole issue of psychological safety in the workplace is also playing out in a negative manner in your personal life, and both things are out of kilter, that's going to be a very stressful world to be living in.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And Jessie might have more to add on how secure relationships can really be a resource that allows us to navigate stress. But that's certainly something that I see in the people that I work with. If there are difficulties at work, but there's a really supportive partner at home who you're able to lean on and debrief with and problem solve together, then it can feel more manageable. Whereas if the person is maybe single or they're lacking those emotional supports in their personal life, then it can feel impossible to navigate that work situation. And similarly, people are navigating, divorces and court proceedings or estrangement from parents or other family members, but they have an incredibly supportive team at work. And so they're able to lean on co-workers for support and debrief. And so, they will talk about, friends and co-workers being a life raft that helped them to get through a really difficult situation in their personal life. So the power of relationships, I think, can't be understated. When we have them, it makes difficult situations easier, and when they're lacking, it can make things feel really impossible and difficult. And we see people's mental health really suffer when there aren't supportive relationships around.
We actually have a great example of this in the book. We interviewed a woman named Tanvi, and she was kind of new to a managerial role and had a really tough interaction with somebody who was new to working with her. And she was feeling very overwhelmed. And what I appreciated about her was that she leaned on a whole network of people to provide support and also to provide input. So first she spoke to her husband. She went home and has, a supportive relationship with him. But then she also organized a girls' night, and it sort of naturally came up in her girls' night that she was dealing with this difficult situation at work. And because she had such a great social network of women around her who were very insightful about relationships, she was able to get a lot more clarity about what she really needed to do to address this. And after kind of consulting with all of these support people, she was able to come back to work and have a really great conversation with this difficult person that kind of broke open some things that needed discussing. So what I love about that is that it illustrates what Rachel is saying. We can't rely on just a single relationship. It takes a village to support us, because when there's one domain of life that's really difficult, we can lean on these other networks that we have.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, Rachel, if both parts of your world are out of kilter, that's where the mental health issues start to really come into play. Yeah,
absolutely.
So, looking at empathy fatigue, can you talk to us how not to get drawn into somebody else's emotional chaos? Because I think we've potentially all experienced at times there are some people who seem to thrive in chaos, and even when it settles down, they seem to stir it back up again. So how do we not get drawn into that?
One of the things that I will say on that is that, again, our temperament really comes into play here. So there are some people who, as I was saying earlier, are more impacted by situations by nature. They're wired in that way. People who are neurodivergent, people who are highly sensitive, are just more impacted and can have higher empathy for other people as well. And often the practical popular strategies for, setting boundaries and pulling back and, self-care don't translate well for these people, because their nervous system is just so sensitive and so wide for picking up other people's distress and difficulty. And so over the years, I've come to appreciate that there are some people who really can't turn that empathy off, and some people who will just continue to be impacted by other people's distress, not necessarily drama. So if you're saying people are kind of kicking up drama, and that's maybe if they've got an anxious attachment style or something else going on for them, that's their way of kind of relating and staying connected. But if it's true distress and other people's emotions, it can be hard to turn that off. But still, it is important to be aware of that. And I think preventing sometimes yourself from getting into those situations in the first place. So if you're feeling depleted, or that someone is quite emotionally intense and that's going to impact you, then ahead of time you might consider how much time you have to spend with that person. So with the people that I work with, but also in my own life, it might be thinking, okay, I might have time for or capacity for half an hour call with this person, not an hour. Or, I've got a really busy schedule this week, so I'm not going to catch up with this person because it's going to be a lot for me. I'll do it when I have a quieter week. So it might be putting in place strategies like that.
That's really good advice, because sometimes you just don't feel up to it.
Often, depending on what you've got going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are other strategies as well. If people seem to thrive on drama or gossip and you don't want to be a part of that, then giving a neutral response will often mean that they will turn to someone else to try to get that engagement.
Yeah, it's like pouring water on a fire. So if it is more about...
Yeah, that's exactly it. Exactly. So if you don't kind of buy into it and you don't really engage, you just give a kind of neutral, disinterested response, and you use a broken record technique, which is where you give sort of the same response again and again as they tell the story, they're not going to get what they're seeking. And so there's a chance that they might turn to someone else to bring that drama or to bring that gossip.
Yeah, it's a bit like you can't argue with somebody who's not arguing back. So it dilutes it. Yeah. What are your views on that, Jessie?
Well, I love that advice. I might try that out, Rachel.
Let me know how it goes.
I would also say that, the science of empathy really does show that it's a double-edged sword. It is both really useful for maintaining strong relationships. I mean, if you're a more empathetic person, you're a good friend, you're a good partner. I mean, people will come to you with their problems. And in many ways, that's the fabric of society. We need more of that, in my opinion. But on the other hand, when it kind of tips over from empathy into what's called personal distress, where suddenly your capacity to hold other people's emotions becomes overwhelmed, that's associated actually with physiological reactions like increased stress hormones, increased inflammation. So there really can come with a cost. But interestingly, when we are more resourced ourselves, so when we're not pouring from an empty cup, when we have social resources and people we can lean on, when we have sources of joy and other things happening in our lives, that can often mitigate some of the feeling of depletion from having to carry somebody else's load. I also think that, if a relationship becomes really one-sided and you're basically acting as a therapist for a family member or for a friend, that might be a moment to consider giving feedback. Like, I'm noticing that our conversations are a bit one-sided, and, I'm feeling like we don't really have room for other parts of this friendship that I really value, like going out and having fun, or I'd love to tell you about this thing happening in my life. So there is an opportunity also to course correct. And also sometimes there's a limit to our role. So, for example, I have a number of students who work with me, and inevitably really difficult things sometimes happen in their lives. And I'm happy to lend an empathetic ear, but at the same time, I know that I'm not their parent, client and I'm not their therapist. So there's sort of a natural limit where I might refer them, if I think they need it, to somebody professional. And that's kind of within the boundaries of my role. So I can help you to this point. I can walk you to the door of the counseling room. And then, my role as your professor might end there, right? And I think similarly in a work situation, you can be an empathetic person, you can provide a listening ear, and then get the person the support they need from another resource who's better equipped to handle it.
I had a final question for you both today about when is it okay to walk away? And I think in a professional setting, assuming we have other options available to us, we can often be the one to make the call when it's okay to walk away. But in personal relationships and in family, sometimes it can be to our detriment not to walk away. But we hold the power, we hope, in most cases of when to do it. But that calling time on something that's not serving us isn't always easy, is it? Walking away is not always as straightforward as we might think.
Absolutely. And when it is someone that we are close to and attached to or have a really intimate bond with, whether it's a parent or a sibling or a romantic partner or a best friend, we're also bonded, and attached, not in the sense of attachment styles, but really bonded. And I'll often talk to people in sessions who are saying, this person has engaged in all of this really shitty behavior, but I can't let go, and I'm still thinking of them, and it's,
well, we're emotionally invested. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's very, very hard. And sometimes what I'll talk about is sort of using our rational thinking or our prefrontal cortex to override other parts of our brain and nervous system that are so deeply bonded to that person, and kind of unpacking that and what's driving us to stay connected to that person. There's no clear-cut answer about when to walk away. It really is different for everyone. And I see people who hold on for a very, very long time and handle more than you would imagine that people can handle. And then we've also got this kind of cut-off culture that's maybe being popularized on social media at the moment, where, there is some entitlement, and if you do something I don't like, I'll set a boundary and cut you off. That's quite popular at the moment too.
Is that right?
Yeah.
See, there's a generational thing. I'm not aware of that. Where's that playing out? Because that's quite an aggressive behaviour.
Yeah.
It's almost a threat.
And it is used in that way. Honestly, it is. It can be really misused. So boundaries have become popularized in online spaces, on social media, and with it this, I guess, belief or idea that really if someone does something you don't like, you can set a boundary. And the way that that's often framed is that you will tell them, if you do this thing that I don't like, I'm going to cut you off, or I'm not going to spend time with you anymore.
I think that's confusing boundaries with bullying.
Yeah, it can be. And the definition of boundaries that I really like is it's what we are going to do, not what someone else has to do. So it's really what we're comfortable with and what we ourselves are going to do. And we don't always need to communicate that to someone in a thread. It's for myself to know what my boundaries are. So
sometimes you don't have to communicate it at all. You just need to know what the parameters are.
Absolutely. That's such a good way of putting it. And so, using the example that we mentioned earlier, if I feel like my capacity is I have half an hour to spend in this situation or, with this person, that's my boundary. And so it's up to me when I feel maxed out or I get to that limit to say, okay, I've had enough here. I'm not going to say, if you push my boundary, if you go past my boundary, then this is the consequence. I think that's
the threat.
That's something different.
Yeah.
It's a threat.
Yeah.
It's used to manipulate other people.
Yeah.
So, I think there's different ways of approaching things, but it's not always walking away. You may get to a point where you feel like, I can't maintain this relationship anymore. I've tried to change maybe my part. I've tried to give you feedback about your part, and it's not working. I don't feel like I can maintain it. And so we do have breakups. We do have friendships ending. We leave workplaces. We leave friendship groups. But there's a whole lot of steps that can happen before we get to that point. And it may be that the nature of the relationship changes. And so it may be that you shift from a close friendship with someone where you're spending a lot of time with them to it becomes friendly and respectful, but you don't spend a lot of time with that person anymore. You might decide that you've been hurt by trying to be vulnerable with someone, or you discover that you've got capacity differences when it comes to emotional connection. And so you don't continue going to that person to have your emotional needs met or be vulnerable. Instead, it might be that I can have a surface level conversation, a surface level relationship with this person, but I won't go deep anymore. And so the nature of the relationship changes. So there's different ways that we can change a relationship before we ultimately decide, I actually have to leave this relationship because it's so detrimental.
Yeah, as relationships ebb and flow. Yeah, that's great insights. Thank you both so much for outlining that. So as we come to a close today, who have you written this book for beyond Difficut? Who's going to best benefit from grabbing a copy and reading what you've so thoughtfully put to paper?
I think both of us, our hope is that this is a book for anyone who has dealt with difficult relationships, meaning everybody. So there are stories of parenting with a difficult kid. There are stories of dealing with difficult workplaces, and there are stories of navigating tough friendships. So our hope is that this is accessible to anybody who really wants to boost their relational capacities and feel a little bit more empowered to work towards secure attachment in their own lives, but also to repair relationships that have not been going well. Oftentimes we think of conflict as a bad thing, but I hope that part of the book will reframe conflict as opportunity for growth and for repair and for actually strengthening the bonds that we have. So I'm hopeful that this will appeal to anybody who's dealt with a difficult person, which I think is all of us.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are immune, and that's such a great call out, and I'll put it back to you as the listener to be sure to share this episode with somebody who you think might benefit from it and possibly is going through a scenario with a difficult person. I only had a situation in the last few days where a listener reached out because of a particular episode that we did about women bullying women, and they had been through that scenario and they just wanted to say thank you because it was a helpful particular episode to listen to. It resonated with their own circumstances. So again, if you feel somebody would benefit from listening to what Jessie and Rachel have said today, and perhaps recommending they pick up a copy of the book Beyond Difficut, please do so. And you can also point them to my website, which is powerofwomen.com.au, where you can find the full library of episodes and work your way through what makes the most sense for you and really strikes a chord. Until next time. If you're loving the Power of Women podcast, hit that subscribe button and be sure that you never miss an episode. Until next time.